First, we will keep on with the round table that has the title of Law, Company, and Government. This is a panel desperately wide as to its goal. Law, enterprise, and government with respect to transhumanism is so big that I believe that we'd have to explain why we have stated it in this manner. There are two reasons for it. The first one has to do with the wish of the university, that is the school that is being built in this university, to try to have a multidisciplinary and transdisciplinary approach to this big issue that we are debating during those days. The second reason has to do with the effort of looking for a link between those two areas of knowledge and praxis as well. And what we think right now is that there are two fundamental ideas or two fundamental concepts that can help us to put in order this panel that will be very impressionistic. And what gives a consistency to it is the brilliant nature and the experience of the three speakers that are here with me. This is what guarantees that we are going to have an impressionistic picture, or that will give rise to very suggestive ideas and provoking thoughts as well. The main idea is the one of the system. We have talked this morning about systems that help in decision making, the right of law, politics, and companies and enterprises, and process procedures that help to obtaining goals, to reaching goals that are included in a community. As to systems, they can be helped. They are being helped impressively by the badly called, but we are going to use the term that is most familiar, by the artificial intelligence. And of course, we see many examples of how the right is using these technologies to try to reach better its goals. The second idea that will be explored in this panel is the concept of person, the anthropology that is underlying those three dimensions. And this is very important because even from the perspective of the artificial intelligence, the type of approach, the type of goals of these systems depend greatly on the people that are designing these technological tools. And the anthropological issue, that is underlying the legal, entrepreneurial, and political systems that we see worldwide, is something that we are very much interested in. In order to be able to study those two ideas and think about the consequences in the legal, political, environmental level of artificial intelligence that is looking from a certain ideological perspective, a transhuman or posthuman being, we have wanted to invite three first-level speakers from different origins. I'm going to introduce them in the order they are going to speak. First of all, Professor Enrique Gómez Aguilera, who is Professor of Biomedical Engineering of the Polytechnical University of Madrid, Director of the Research Group in Bioengineering and Telemedicine, Director of the Master in Biomedical Engineering from the Polytechnical University of Madrid. He's chairing the current Society of Biomedical and also engineering by nanomedicine from the Instituto de Salud Carlos III. He has published several papers, scientific papers, participated in hundreds of international congresses, in more than 60 research projects inside and outside Spain, and his interest conference in guided image surgery and image-guided surgery. He was member of the European Alliance for Biological Medical Science and member of the International Federation of Medical Engineering and Biological. Enrique, it's a pleasure to have you here with us in this panel. Thank you for being with us. The second speaker is not with us here, present, but he's in university in Indiana. He couldn't come due to the pandemic. His institution didn't authorize him to fly here to be with us, but he will connect it. He will be visible within a few minutes. Carter Sneed directs the Nicola Center for Ethics and Culture, is one of the main experts and by neuroethic. The improvement of the species research with stem cells, abortion, and the decision-making at the end of life. Author of 40 papers and interviews, chapters and essays, editor of 2 series of books for the Journal of the University of Notre Dame, and studies in medical ethics. Professor Sneed is giving talks in different branches in the University of Notre Dame. Sneed has been advisor with public policies in different civil servants in the United States. In 1926, bioethical of Papa, the Pope Franciscus, elected member of the Hastings Center, the bioethical dependent most oldest institute in the world. And finally, last but not least, we have Alberto Cortina Ramos, who is a lawyer and urbanistic director of the study DTUM, and who is a consultant in terms of urban planning. He has a master in regional studies, urban and metropolitan studies, and he promotes in his work on ethics applied to urban planning. And apart from that, Albert Cortina is an expert in transhumanism, posthumanism, and ethics of exponential technologies. Along that line, he has driven the advanced humanism, where the biotechnologies are at the service of people, life networks, and common good. Researcher and author of many books related with these issues, amongst which we can point out Advanced Humans for a Biotechnological Society, published in 2017, and Transhumanism and New World Order in 2021. So without further ado, I'm going to give the floor to Professor Enrique Gómez Aguilera so that he can start this reflection. Thank you very much. I hope they all don't speak that fast. Thank you very much. Let's see if we can see the projection, the slides. First of all, I would like to thank for this invitation to participate in this Congress that seems fascinating to me. It's the first contact with this world of transhumanism, so I apologize for that. And I thank for the invitation to Professor Javier Lecendra, Elena Postigo, and all the organizers for the opportunity I have been given to share with you some ideas. The title is slightly provocative, and maybe in collaboration with the president of this panel, we will see if we can or not advance in this field. I dedicate to biomedical engineering, so this is one of the issues that I logically want to talk about. When we talk about this discipline, I think it's easy to understand what this discipline is dedicating to. We can see that in such a terrible crisis as the one we have suffered with COVID-19, thanks to biomedical engineering, the scientific progress, and the possibility of reaching all of us, or bringing to all of us all this technology, we can have in vitro diagnostic tests, technologies in the hospitals that have been indispensable to achieve differential diagnosis in respiratory syndromes through the medical images. Thinking about a hospital or a medical event without a medical image today is practically impossible, or even due to the amount of human lives that have been saved thanks to technologies as mechanical ventilator, the breathing systems, the monitors, any intensive care unit of any hospital. And something that has also this pandemic has brought about is telemedicine. We have been more than 25 years working on it, but in 6 months it has made a complete revolution, the possibility of doing these medical actions at a distance. So if we go to the more formal aspect of biomedical engineering, the scientific discipline that relates principles of engineering, medicine, and biology for the care of health, it is focused directly on medicine. So it looks for solutions and interdisciplinary. It's an absolutely interdisciplinary area. Those of us who dedicate to medical bioengineering, we work from the beginning with medical professors, with healthcare providers. If we don't do it like that, we will not be medical engineers, but the biomedical engineers work from the very beginning, understanding the problem and looking for a solution in a joint manner. For what? To diagnose, to advance in the diagnosis, the monitoring, the therapy, or prevention. There is another different area of biomedical engineering that is very important. I bring it forward in order to differentiate it because sometimes the terms, as has been said before, are confounding. Biotechnology is another area. It's not biomedical engineering. It's also a very important area, fascinating, that has to do very much with transhumanism, but it's different. It's based on biological processes in living organisms with many applications, one of them in the field as well of the human being and medicine. But there is a very important aspect, the vaccines. The vaccines have a lot to do with the area of biotechnology, but I wanted to differentiate them. The discipline is a young discipline, well, from the formal aspect, yes. Practically, at the midst of the last century, we had started having the convergence, the need that biologists, physicians, engineers found a common space in order to understand the problems and look for solutions. And in fact, we have the biomedical engineering that is born when they look for that total interdisciplinarity by the end of the 70s. But this area as such, we can say that it exists since then. But allow me to look at the past rapidly to try to better understand the present and the future if possible. We are not going to be able to predict it, but at least we have to bear it in mind. When we talk about all this, we have to go back to the Renaissance, and there is a person that you all know probably, that I bring him here because he's the precursor of bionics. Da Vinci, a great artist. What he was he was a great painter and also a great engineer. He was able to generate drawings that allowed to build machines. But at the end, we can say that his interest was for this machine and the man tried to use to understand the human body, anatomy, physiology, and from there on, build machines that had to do with all these basic or fundamentals. Many of them were not invented by him. He was able just to put into fantastic texts and drawings, but I think that we could consider him the precursor of the bionics concept that has been mentioned here several times in a brilliant manner yesterday. If we go along, we go to the 17th, 18th century, 19th, with the electromedicine beginnings. There is a technological singularity. Mankind starts using another type of energy, that is electricity in all its forms, continuous, direct, alternating, of any type of implementation, with fascinating machines as those machines based on rotation machines or the Leyden bottle, and that gives the rise to the possibility of having tools to try to advance in the knowledge of animal electricity. And here we have two big important persons. One, Professor Galvani from Bologna University, very interested in trying to understand the bioelectrogenesis and say that the type of potentials that are in the health and the human and the living being, and from very interesting experiments tried to discover how through the study of the frogs he could be able to understand how these potentials were possible. He decided the nervous fluid, this relationship with electricity, in a wrong manner, because in reality what he was doing when he was introducing those cables within in the frog's leg after what Professor Volta showed later on in Pavia University, he had invented without knowing the electrochemical battery, and this is what allows the advance of science. What is true is that all this reaches something that has already been mentioned here. Really, all this scientific progress led to this fantastic literary fiction that you all know, the fantastic book of Frankenstein, or the modern Prometheus. Frankenstein, knowing all these things, tries to explore those new paths, those deep mysteries of creation, looking for the generation of life. And the text reflects many of the scientific concerns that we're discussing here about. Legitimacy of research, the capacity of the human being to create and destroy life. The truth is that today we have a plethora of solutions, technological solutions and devices that allow us to monitor practically in any place physiological variables, as those that we can see here. We can do that even with bracelets connected to these other systems. There are systems of 4 million people in the world that have devices that are implanted. Look, in the case of a pacemaker or a cochlear prosthesis, the medical images that have revolutionized medicine and allow us to see the human being as we never had done before. A virtual surgery of the surgeons can simulate an intervention and then use a robot to carry it out. And also telemedicine that changes greatly the paradigm of medicine, because the empowerment, we have the capacity to use technology in a different manner. We know more our human body, we know more our data, and with all this we try to improve with the direct responsibility our health. There is no doubt about the fact that when we talk about biomedical engineering, transhumanism, we talk about the postulates that super intelligence, super longevity, that look for the search for human welfare. Biomedicine is offering solutions since then, but always from a very tightly related goal to the challenge is medicine, and within that setting. In fact, well, the question, can we or should we apply these biomedical technologies outside of this context for improving the human condition? Of course, we have the bionics and the artificial organs, but look at the end. They are created to be able to have technologies that allow to re-establish a function of the body, a function that has been lost, the heart that doesn't work. Let's see if there is an artificial heart that can replace it. That person who has the hearing system that is failing and uses a cochlear prosthesis, a heart valve, or the bionic prosthesis that have also given many possibilities to an amputated person that in the end has the possibility of being able to walk again in a practically as a normal person. This person who has both legs and the cases of prosthesis associated to the upper limb, something that is very complex. We talk about more than 25 degrees of freedom. But the doubt is, can we use those technologies beyond their goal in order to make the human beings to be more powerful, more potent, bring it to exoskeletons? As, for instance, brain stimulation as well. We can apply magnetic fields so that with magnetic transcranial stimulation we can treat and even cure depression, for instance. But logically we are treating, in this case, we are creating an impact and changing our neuronal circuits, and we could do that with other goals. And also the deep brain stimulation. We are implanting electrodes at the subcortical level, and we are also looking for solving the problem, as has been shown, of eliminating tremor in Parkinson. But the question again is, up to what extent does this not mean if we use all this technology out of context, associated risks to their use outside of their primary goal? And what we are doing as a technological partner in relation with institutions from Barcelona, the university on the one side, and then Harvard as well, to try to know what are how can we promote brain health, detect on an early basis risk indicators of the brain health to the passage of a neurodegenerative disease with a longitudinal prospective trial of more than 700,000 healthy volunteers between 40 and 65 years of age, and analyzing in 7 domains from the cognitive point of view: physical, nutritional, vital, general health, socialization, and sleep, and be able to somehow to reach something important, not increase longevity, but be able to make those persons to live what they have to live thanks to technology and medical progress in the best possible way with the best possible quality of life. All this comes to us through the industry of medical technology. That is a very consolidated industry and very structured industry through classified with medical devices, with all these examples that I mentioned before, in vitro diagnosis, non-invasive tests that are using biological samples, or digital health. These are market terms where we talk about tools as telemedicine. Look at that there are more than 500,000 medical technologies available today at present. So we are able to see, if you want to know it more, through the MedTech Europe Association, you can know exactly the list and the state of the art of this type of technology. This is an industry that moves more than 120 billion in the market with more than 32,000 companies, 95% small SMEs that really are linked to spin-offs and startups that come from the academic world, because biomedical engineering is a very innovative world. Innovation in health technologies is one of the most important fields of innovation. But it has a characteristic. It's a very regulated industry, and it's very regulated both in the European Union and in the North American world by the FDA. So I'm not going to go into details, but the devices are classified. They have you can see many directives, some from May 21, another one that May 22, and what can and can't be done is absolutely regulated. We have the ethics committees, and the trials have to be done under specific conditions. But what happens when we go outside of the regulated world? Well, no doubt that each one can start do it yourself. So at the end, the people have more and more information. They have access to technology. They can collaborate among them. The crowdsourcing during the pandemic, many people collaborated in order to build respirators, for instance, or ventilators. Some couldn't be used later on just because they were not regulated technologies. But biohacking appears, and the two terms, biology and hacking, in the most positive part, the idea of knowledge from the point of view of the computer world, that postulates that each individual can implement in himself the advances in biomedical engineering to extend their physical and mental capabilities, claiming for a scientific alphabetization that is able to make each human being to be responsible of himself in the surrounding world. These are postulates that are very delicate because it would be to bring it to the world of do-it-yourself genetics that is also or have been commented in this lecture, in this conference. Some were mentioned in the inauguration conference. There are companies that implant microchips to the employees. Instead of using your card, your mobile, you can open a door, access a vending machine. In principle, these are radio frequency devices that act when there is an external system that interacts, that conveys an information, and it can even be with the mobile phone. Well, it will be depend on how it's going to be used, but they entail many problems, bioethical problems, because those employees are not forced to use it. In fact, there are many legal aspects of privacy, safety, ethical. There are many denouncements that have been done associated with this use. Another example is implantable devices developed in this case by Fircadia. What it does, it allows to read medical data with the grindhouse wetware that give project of open code. You can download it and then implant it in your hand to have your medical data, or because we want to have some LEDs that send some messages or text from time to time.
So, and this we could say would be anecdotal, but we also mentioned before, and the previous speaker also did so, there's more and more new commercial players in this world. So from the point of view of technologies, well, you can see them on the screen, and they are slowly investing billions of dollars in the world of medical technology, biomedical technology, iPhones that allow us to connect to a brain-computer interface. And so I wonder whether perhaps transhumanism is behind many of these industries. So, to a certain extent, something that might be considered interesting is really the mainstay in this process. And this is a possibility because, human beings always wanted to use their intelligence to improve themselves. But can this enhancement of human beings affect their own being and their own dignity? And this is an example. Let's imagine a real case of a child who is 5 years old and has a terrible road accident on the way to school, and he loses his right arm. The arm is amputated, and there's different technologies that may help him, like bionic prosthesis, which may help him. And in this case, this child, is going to, go to Tokyo to, participate in the Olympic Games for disabled people. And that was thanks to this prosthesis. So are we looking for the new Prometheus? Because many of the ideas on life and death and removing disease and making more beautiful and happier human beings, some people may consider that many of these advances, behind them there's just a whim. And maybe Dr. Frankenstein, who's playing the part of God. When we asked students the world of simulators and image-guided technology, I always tell them to think of a flight simulator, and through a flight simulator, we might build a surgical simulator. And what is a flight simulator? Well, it's a system that was created by an engineer in the same way as a plane, which exactly reproduces the characteristics of the planes and has the same specifications. If you sit down, it's like as if you were in a plane. But if you want to generate a surgical simulator, I ask you the same question. We can construct all the technology behind the simulators, but who has created human beings? Well, and that depends on your beliefs. We don't know those specifications. So the capacity to reproduce the abdomen and the different organs is very limited. We're not the creators of that entity, and so our knowledge is limited. And same goes if we have somebody who has a disability and they don't want to live anymore, we might copy all of that intelligence so that we can place all of that on a cyborg or some human body. But to think that you can reproduce a human body, well, we are still far away from, making those kinds of copies. But biomedical engineering only makes sense if it can contribute solutions to real problems of medicine. And we need to understand the non-desired, non-wanted effects, because we might wonder if it makes sense to lengthen people's lives without any purpose, or if we are turning technology into a kind of philosophy, or whether perhaps it might be more important to ensure a good quality of life, rather than ensuring the person a long life. Because does it make sense to lengthen somebody's life if that person is going to be alone, for example? So biomedical engineering exists, of course. It has existed for a long time, and it is at a place where science cannot distinguish between living or inert matter. And that's all I wanted to share with you, and see to what extent my contribution can add value to this conference. Thank you.
Sí, se proyecta. Sí, se proyectará. Bien. Buenos días.
Good morning. Thank you to the organizers. I want to express my thankfulness to Elena Postigo and to Javier for inviting me to this impressionistic roundtable. I will change gears for my presentation, and I will try and make an exploratory presentation, and I will try and raise these 4 issues which have been turning in my mind for a long time, because when we speak about transhumanism and posthumanism, we are dealing with an emerging ideology, because it is an ideology, as has been said. And I'm going to try and see whether that is going to be, or is already being, the ideology that is best adapted to technological globalization, whether this new international order that is emerging in the 21st century clearly needs the transhumanistic ideology. Afterwards, I will ask myself, and I will discuss with you, whether this ideology is going to affect, or is already affecting, the application of human rights, which have been declared by the UN, and whether we are going to formulate a new generation of human rights, which we could call post-human rights, and whether, with all of this, we're going to be needing a new social contract, considering the disruption that is happening in the legal, social, and economic and democratic order. So first things first. So is transhumanism an ideology that is compatible or is useful for this era? Well, in my view, there's a replacement is taking place, and because transhumanism is sometimes compared with, sometimes some people say, well, transhumanism is linked to the West or to neoliberalism. But what I'm going to try and explain briefly is that there's a mutation is taking place of neoliberalism based upon rugged individualism and on subjectivity, destructive deregulation of mood, emotions, complex management of those emotions. And very often, there's even nihilism, a kind of democratized I, typical of capitalism. Feelings, therefore, may be construed as a moral guideline. Because yesterday people were saying that transhumanism was following enlightenment, but I think the social body is changing, and what people believe now is that my wish is law. There's a kind of emotional governance, as you may call it. But if we talk about this, and I've said that it seems that there is a replacement of emotional neoliberalism by a kind of communal spirit, because elites have realized that so much individualism is not good for us. However, technocratic policies might be used to contain that dissolution of the neoliberal system, making individuals, turning them into more socialized beings. And then data analysis is used to guide decisions, to guide individual decisions. Right. And this, of course, is a danger, because this massive collection of data about us, how it is managed, how cognitive psychology and neurology are used to do so, well, have created difficult situations. Another important thing that I wanted to mention is that we're also thinking whether this is going to be done by the state or whether this is going to be done by corporations. And there we need to speak about a mutation of global governance, because to some extent, through the 2030 agenda of the United Nations and international organizations, and through the obligations that supranational organizations are imposing on states, these are not direct rules, but they are guidelines. And so they're meant to reorganize that globalization process. And there's a very clear influence of those international organizations, but at the same time, of corporations. Some of them have been mentioned. There's a constellation of corporations that are trying to replace this nation state by a kind of corporate state, a kind of partnership between the state as we've known it so far, but not resting on the nation state, but on corporations. And global supranational organizations play a very important role, such as the United Nations, right? So this is a context, a global geopolitical context, that I think we should take into account to decide whether transhumanism is going to penetrate into those elites, into those corporations that, to a certain extent, are designing this global technological governance, whether that new international order of the corporate state is going to implement, in the West at least, we don't know much about Asia, but whether, they're going to implement this transhumanism. But you need to beware with this type of beware of this type of governance where we may transfer control of our data because we know what our friend Huxley said, not a brave new world, but a dictatorship, a global dictatorship. Right. So, and the threads of this transformation may not be the nation states, but those corporations which will even replace liberal capitalism for a kind of state-guided capitalism. And China is precisely developing the ideology of transhumanism with greatest energy. And is this going to affect the fundamental rights as we know them? Are we, well, to a certain extent, our legal system, fundamental rights, are based on the concept of the person, of human nature, as we have understood them, as we have known them throughout the Christian humanist tradition. But that dissolution of the individual raised by transhumanism will have to affect the current legal system, which is precisely based on this concept of the individual, the subject, not just. It's a complex concept, right, of a person, of human nature, dignity, natural law. So those fundamental rights that are inherent in the generic and complex concept of the individual at present have been put to question because transhumanism wants to abolish human nature. That new approach has to enter the legal discussion. We are at an exploratory stage. We legal experts don't know what the change of paradigm is going to be for the law, whether there can be a person without human nature, or human rights. At the same time as transhumanism wants to dissolve or abolish human nature, there's also a big confusion around identity. And that is going to have certain repercussions, and we will see this later because there will be new generations of transhuman rights. So what are those limits? Because yesterday we said that this was not anthropology, but that transhumanist ideology, what happens if we apply it to the law? How is it going to affect the different generations of different declarations of human rights that we have? So there was a first generation, which was the original Declaration of Fundamental Rights that protected the citizen vis-à-vis the power of the state. Then there was a second generation which considered social rights, and then the third one was consistent with globalization. It discussed the environment and peace. But now we are in the midst of the fourth generation of fundamental rights, still within the framework of protection of the individual, of the human individual, and managing the technological aspect. So it's not protection vis-à-vis the state, but there is this idea that technologies, managing technologies, may severely affect individuals and citizens. And so in this fourth wave, in this fourth stage of fundamental rights, a series of rights have been enunciated. So all of this is being included in the digital transformation in some declarations and manifestos. For example, the University of Deusto in 2018 proclaimed the Declaration of Human Rights in a digital environment. Telefónica, a Spanish corporation, launched a manifesto for a new digital compact, and the Bar Association of Barcelona launched a charter of citizen rights in the digital era. And more recently, the Spanish government has been working on a charter for digital rights, which also has received input from the Spanish Bioethical Committee that has explained how they see the application of such a charter in the digital environment. This is the least transhumanist part of things, because Dr. Marcus said we are concerned about the right to disconnection, the right to oblivion on the internet, and there's many lawyers specializing in this. But I didn't want to focus on this aspect. I wanted to focus rather on whether there is a formulation of a new set of rights. This will be the fifth generation, because the ideology of transhumanism is catching on in those corporations, whether this is going to affect the formulation of a set of human rights which would be a kind of transition towards a post-human world. And Professor Gomez mentioned something very interesting, because do we have an unlimited right to our own body? I'm not talking about disabilities or accidents. I'm talking about the transhumanist vision of designing yourself as you wish. This idea I mentioned before, my desire is law. And there's a practice of garage biology. Let's decentralize. We don't want to develop all of these advancements at institutes or academies or recognized centers. Let's do it as people did internet at the beginning, in a garage. Let's democratize everything, and each person should do, whatever he or she thinks right. And this may be quite dangerous. You might say, well, but this doesn't really happen. But this image has been shown by several speakers. Yes, people are saying, why can't I have a chip implanted into my body? Why can't I transform and modify my body to make it hybrid, to make it trans-species? Dr. Postigo mentioned a child who wanted to wear a fin, or an antenna, right? So ceasing to be a human to become something else. So ideological pressure is being brought to bear also in the world of art. I think then there will be a panel on design and art. There's no limit to creativity. So a debate is being proposed which is fundamental. Will cyborgs, hybrid human beings and trans-species beings, can they become a new generation? Can they have a right to a new set of human rights? Because they want to have their own identity. And then, we could also say, I may have a right to modify myself because I want to be part of a program to conquer the universe. Who may prevent me from doing that? Because we know that these interstellar journeys, will require that human beings modify their natural conditions. And this is the end of my talk, because it's the idea is whether these electronic individuals, these autonomous beings, they don't have conscience or intelligence, but they may demand, or their owners or the companies that are responsible for designing them may claim a certain number of rights for these beings. So, are we going to need a new social contract vis-à-vis the disruption of this ideology, which little by little is becoming more and more important in this global order and in our legal system and our economic and democratic systems? So it is fundamental to consider the inequality that this may generate. How are we going to resolve in a democratic society that needs to defend fundamental rights, that those inequalities that may be generated by the different technological speeds of human beings? When we speak about the new social contract, well, we detect that there may be a kind of biopower, a series of organisms which are controlling life. They wield general control of life through different transhumanist formulas. And so citizens, and this is the last thing I'm going to say, linking up with what Dr. Marco was saying, we need to conclude a new social contract, but with whom? With the monopolies, with the Chinese Communist Party? Who are we going to trust? Who are we going to entrust with governing our lives in the next few decades? And this entails a reset, a really important reset. Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very much, Enrique. Thank you very much, Alberto.
Por lo menos hemos conseguido
So we have managed to ensure Carter's participation. We're very happy about this because this morning we had problems getting in touch with him, but he's here with us and we thank him for having made this effort. We're going to be devoting half an hour to listening to him and then ask him some questions. We're going to finish at 3 o'clock. We're going to finish this session at 3 o'clock. So without further ado, I will give the floor to the speaker because we have already introduced him this morning. Carter.
Yes, sir. Hi.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Carter. Wonderful to have you here with us. It's really great. We're very much relieved and happy to have you here. So I was just introducing you and saying that at 3 p.m. sharp, we do need to finish this session. So the floor is yours. We should have a few minutes towards the end for any questions, Q&A session that might be very interesting in the light of your talk. So please go ahead.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And I appreciate your accommodation. I'm terribly sorry about the confusion on the timing. I'd like to thank everyone associated with El Congreso Razón Abierta for inviting me and hosting me, all of the wonderful people, the rector of the university and the amazing faculty, and you, Javier. Thank you so much. I'm very delighted to be able to discuss today the themes of my recent book, What It Means to Be Human, The Case for the Body in Public Bioethics, because I think it's directly relevant to the larger question of the conference, namely the question of transhumanism, which is antithetical in many respects to the body, as I'm sure you all have been discussing. It seeks to annihilate and replace the body rather than to embrace our lives as embodied beings. The claims of my talk are twofold. The first is methodological. The first argument is that the richest and most potent method of analyzing matters of public bioethics is through what I describe as an inductive anthropological inquiry. And all I mean by that is asking the fundamental question of what vision of human identity and flourishing is anchoring and animating the law and public policy of public bioethics. What vision of the human person does the law assume as it constructs doctrines and practices and policies meant to protect and promote the flourishing of human beings? That's the methodological claim. The best way into these matters is to ask that question. The second claim of the book is substantive. And the argument that I make in the book is that when you analyze the vital conflicts of American public bioethics or any any nation's bioethical framework. It's not limited to the United States. When you analyze the bioethical landscape as far as the law and policy is concerned, the dominant anthropology that frequently comes to the surface is one that very closely resembles what has been described by philosophers Charles Taylor, social scientist Robert Bellah, and others as expressive individualism. And my argument is that that's a vision that cannot and does not make sense of the lived reality of human embodiment, namely our vulnerability, our reciprocal dependence, and our subjection to natural limits. And thus, expressive individualism is not a suitable anthropological grounding for public bioethics or perhaps any area of law and public policy. So very briefly, I will define what I mean by public bioethics. I will explain very briefly why I take this anthropological analysis of law and public policy to be the best point of entry into these questions. I will talk about expressive individualism and explain why, briefly, I believe that it's an incomplete conception of the self that is, in the words of my colleague Alistair McIntyre, forgetful of the body. And then I will propose very briefly a pathway to recovering the wisdom about our embodied lives, to a pathway that is followed by remembering the body. It's an anthropological corrective. And I'll also briefly note what I take to be the goods and practices and virtues that are necessary for our shared embodied life, for our survival, and for our flourishing. So, let me start very briefly by saying what I mean by the domain of public bioethics. Public bioethics is not merely a field of intellectual inquiry. It is instead the domain of governance of science, medicine, and biotechnology in the name of ethical goods. It is the point at which the law and the government comes into play and weighs in on these contested questions, these ethical questions that arise from advances in biomedical science and biotechnology and the practice of medicine, and seeks to provide a framework within which human beings can flourish, can be safe, and can pursue a variety of goods. Public bioethics is fundamentally concerned with human vulnerability, dependence, frailty, and finitude. It is about procreation and pregnancy and babies and wasting illnesses, devastating injuries, desperate enrollees in clinical trials, fearful patients, the disabled, the elderly, the dying, and the dead. Put another way, public bioethics is most deeply about the meaning and consequences of human embodiment and the fact that we experience ourselves, one another, and the world around us in, and more importantly, as living and dying bodies. The issues in American public bioethics, in Spanish public bioethics, and public bioethics around the world, and intergovernmental fora like the Council of Europe or UNESCO are broad and manifold. They embrace, as I say, every aspect connected to the dimensions of human embodiment. They began in the crucible of the question of human subjects protections, but have expanded into embryo and fetal research, assisted reproduction, abortion, end-of-life decision-making, and on and on. In my book, I take up what I call the three vital conflicts of public bioethics: the law and policy of abortion, assisted reproduction, and end-of-life decision-making. Now, I should say very briefly that when I criticize the anthropological assumptions of American public bioethics or international public bioethics, I'm not criticizing people and their own intuitions and ideas about who they are and what their self-understanding is. I'm criticizing instead what the presumptions of the law that the law uses to erect its doctrines and public policies. And the argument I make is that there's an asymmetry between the assumptions that the law makes about who we are and what our flourishing is, and the lived reality of who we are and what our flourishing is. And that includes those people who seek abortions, who are seeking assisted reproductive technologies, IVF, and so forth, or even those who are seeking to end their own lives through assisted suicide. I'm not making a claim about what those people think or understand or believe about their own needs. I'm talking about what the law assumes. And my argument fundamentally is that the law's assumptions conflict with and are not the same as the actual lived needs, dreams, experiences, hopes, and risks to which all those individuals are subject to. So Briefly, why do I believe that anthropology is the most fruitful avenue into understanding these questions? And it's very straightforward. The first point is that law is about and for the protection and flourishing of persons. That's what law is for. Law is meant to protect persons, to promote their flourishing, and it can do so in a variety of ways. It doesn't have to do so directly. Law can simply create the spaces within which private ordering can promote human flourishing and protect individuals. But it also can do so very directly through encouragement, for example, through the granting of funding, or at the other end of the spectrum, through restriction, through criminal prohibition, seeking to deter behaviors that are deemed to be bad or harmful, or even to punish those behaviors. But between those two poles, there's a very fine-grained spectrum of what the law can do to shape behavior and to teach people about what they should understand to be the content of justice and freedom and autonomy and such like. But because law is for the promotion of flourishing of persons and for the protection of persons, it has to operate from a background assumption about what and who persons are and what human flourishing is. And so therefore, I argue that the richest and deepest understanding of the law is therefore anthropological. It's analyzing the law's assumptions about human identity and flourishing. More specifically, in order to best understand the law of public bioethics, we have to understand who and what the law assumes a person to be, and ask the question, is the law built on a true or false understanding of human nature? There's no avoiding assumptions about who and what a person is and what human flourishing is. It has to be present before the law erects its doctrines and policies that are meant to protect and promote the flourishing of persons. There's no neutrality possible on the question of what and who a person is in this respect. So when I looked at these vital conflicts of public bioethics, the law of abortion, assisted reproduction, and end-of-life decision-making, what came to the surface was this vision of the person that captures something partially true about who we are, but leaves behind some of the most essential truths about who we are, and therefore can't make sense of our fundamental needs and protect us in the appropriate ways, especially protecting the weakest and most vulnerable, that is children, the elderly, and the disabled. And that vision of the person is called expressive individualism. It views the person as an isolated, unencumbered, atomized individual self, abstracted from all connections, all constitutive attachments, all defining attachments to family or community or religion or voluntary associations, whatever kind of external realities there might be, or connective realities that there might be that define who we are and what our flourishing is, are shorn from the fundamental personal reality, which is deemed to be an isolated, unencumbered, atomized individual self. And that self is defined by the will or the mind. It's defined entirely through a cognitive frame. What makes a person in this account of expressive individualism is the will, or the capacity for a will, the capacity to choose, the capacity to through introspection to find one's own authentic truths and to define life accordingly. And everything else, including the body itself, is instrumental to pursuing those goals that are constructed freely from the inside of the individual will, which defines the person. And as I say, the person in this context is defined as an individual chooser or consumer. And human flourishing is defined as the pursuit of projects of one's own construction. There's an imperative to live out your originality or your authenticity. You are, in the world of Michael Sandel's, Harvard philosopher Michael Sandel, a self-originating source of valid claims. The truth is on the inside. The truth is not on the outside. The only morally definitive voice comes from inside, and it can be original and perhaps even transgressive. It is, to use a philosophical phrase, anti-teleological. External givens of the physical world, of the external reality that we encounter, are not normative. The only thing that is normative is the unique and original inner voice. There are no such thing as unchosen obligations or constitutive attachments. No one has a claim on me unless I choose ex ante to grant my consent to render aid or to provide or to engage at all in any kind of interaction. There is no such thing as an unchosen obligation. Personal relationships are instrumental and transactional to these ends, including familial relationships. Persons encounter one another as collaborators sometimes, but frequently encounter one another as isolated adversaries clad in the armor of their rights. There's a very limited vision of ethical goods within this framework. Autonomy is the highest good to which all others are subordinated, and injustice is conceived as the constraint on freedom to pursue the projects of one's own choosing. And the role of government is to remove these constraints and otherwise provide the conditions for the assertion of the unencumbered individual self, to remove the public constraints, to remove the private constraints, perhaps even to remove the natural constraints that obstruct the assertion of the unencumbered self and the realization of the will. And this is a deep connection, as you can see, to the philosophy of transhumanism. So the problem with expressive individualism is that it is, to borrow a phrase from Alistair McIntyre, forgetful of the body. It ignores our lived embodied reality because it only understands the person through the lens of his or her mind or will. It forgets the fact that we are actually the dynamic union of mind and body, and that our bodies are essential part of our lived reality. They define the self in an essential way. And because we are bodies in time that are fragile and corruptible and age and get sick and die, everyone, no matter who you are, is subject to the realities of the body, which is to say mutual dependence, vulnerability, natural limits, and that's everybody. That includes everyone. Everyone comes into the world radically dependent upon others for their survival and their flourishing. And even in the very best case scenario, we ultimately follow a very gentle arc up to the height of our powers, and then but immediately begin a decline back towards total dependence once again. And because of that, embodied beings, for their survival and flourishing, require what McIntyre describes as networks of unconditional and uncalculated giving and graceful receiving, composed of people who are willing to make the good of others their own good. That's what we need to flourish and survive as an embodied being, which we all are. We need networks of people who are willing to make our good their good without seeking anything in return. And we obviously, by virtue of these networks, survive and live. We depend on these networks to survive and live, but then we also depend on these networks to learn to become the thing that we are meant to be, namely those kinds of persons who can make the good of others our own good without seeking anything in return. Put very succinctly, I argue by virtue of our embodiment, human beings are made for love and friendship. And an ideology that doesn't understand the body as essential to human identity doesn't understand this fundamental point and leaves behind those who are uniquely dependent. Expressive individualism in this way is distinctively myopic. It misses the reality of dependence. It doesn't recall or foresee our past or future vulnerability. It doesn't recognize claims of unchosen obligations. It doesn't recall or repay debts. It's intolerant of imperfection. And most importantly, it leaves behind those people who are incapable of flourishing under the auspices of expressive individualism. It leaves behind children and the disabled and the elderly because it can't even make sense of what they are, because they are not capable of flourishing through the lens of expressive individualism. And so what must we do to recover an appropriate anthropology that fills out the truth? It is true, by the way, that we're free and we're particular, and there are truths about who we are in expressive individualism, but it's not the whole truth of who we are because it leaves behind the reality of embodiment. And we have to remember the body. We have to recognize and learn to participate in these networks of uncalculated giving and graceful receiving. And we do this through the cultivation of and practice of memory and the moral imagination, to see the other to whom we have obligations, even those that we don't choose, regardless of our desires and our own internal projects. So to conclude, what do we have to do? What virtues and goods and practices are necessary to build up these networks of uncalculated giving and graceful receiving? They are what McIntyre calls the virtues of acknowledged dependence. First of all, the virtues of uncalculated giving include the virtues and practices of just generosity, giving to others in proportion to their need, without hoping for anything in return, the virtue of hospitality, welcoming the stranger because he or she is a stranger, and the good of misericordia, which is the making of another's suffering our own suffering, and to seek to aid the other who is suffering, and if that's not possible, simply to accompany him or her in their suffering. But also it's important to practice the virtues of graceful receiving, chief among them the virtue of gratitude, to be thankful for the fact that we are only here because others made our good their good without seeking anything in return. And the pristine paradigm of uncalculated giving and graceful receiving is the relationship of parents and children. And this becomes very important in the context of American public bioethics across a variety of contexts. But the virtue of gratitude should also engender the virtue of humility and the idea that we are not responsible for our own flourishing, but in fact depend on others, and realize that everything is a gift and that the gifts are not distributed equally among the human community. And we should come to the aid of those who aren't as blessed as we are in terms of the gifts and privileges that we have. And also this concept of gratitude should open us to the unbidden and to be tolerant of imperfection, and to not to seek to impose rational mastery on everything that we encounter, but rather to embrace the unbidden, to be tolerant of imperfection, and to take things as we find them with gratitude and with kindness. And solidarity, the concept that we are all connected to one another in the human family, and also subject to the same forms of mutual dependence and reciprocal indebtedness. The respect for intrinsic equal dignity of all human beings, born and unborn, is an essential virtue of graceful receiving. The virtue of truthfulness, what we owe to one another by virtue of our equal standing in the human community, to be truthful and not manipulative and not extractive and not instrumental. But finally, the point is that all of these virtues of uncalculated giving and graceful receiving can be viewed fruitfully through the lens of authentic friendship. That is, friendship in the sense of making the good of others our own good without seeking anything in return. And we can practice these virtues by those practices that take us outside of ourselves, that draw our gaze up from the inside, as I said, and to look around to see what others need. The paradigm is parenthood, and we can also flourish with these communities of memory that Bella refers to, where we make the good, we place the good outside of ourselves, outside of our own narrow self-interest, and configure our lives and relationships accordingly. So thank you all. And one last point is that, as I think it was probably clear from my remarks, that transhumanism is not merely forgetful of the body, but it's hostile to the body. It desires to annihilate and replace the body with technology, which I think, and this is maybe a provocative claim, but I think is tantamount to the annihilation of the human race itself. So thank you very much for your attention, and I welcome your questions and comments in the time that we have remaining.
Carter, thank you so much, and also for being sharp with time. So we have still almost 10 minutes for questions from the audience. ¿Hay preguntas en la sala o?
Hello, thank you very much for the talk.
Yes, thank you.
And in particular for your last remarks on the virtues to be cultured, to be pursued in order to be better men and women in our world. In particular, may I draw your attention to the fact that one of the virtues you were mentioning, humility, is specifically rejected by a transhumanist like John Harris, as you know very well. And I guess that other virtues are also being rejected by other transhumanists, maybe not in the wording you mentioned, but under other covers. Do you think that it's a commonplace in many transhumanists to reject virtues as you depicted them to be followed in order to be full men or women? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. As I understand transhumanism, I think that there would be a rejection of the virtues that I suggested. I think the principal reason for that is because transhumanism responds to human dependence in a very different way. Whereas my response to human dependence is to cultivate the virtues that allow us to better take care of one another. And in fact, I argue that we are at our most human when we're taking care of one another, my understanding, and I'm trying to be charitable and open-minded, of course, but my understanding of transhumanism is it responds to human vulnerability and dependence, not by trying to find ways in which we can cultivate our networks of uncalculated giving and grateful receiving, but rather to use technology to separate ourselves from one another, to become independent, to eliminate dependence through technology rather than through collective action with one another. And in some ways, it's, of course, the antithesis of what I'm arguing. I'm arguing we are most human when we're taking care of one another. We're most human when we embrace one another and embrace the proposition that we belong to one another. Whereas transhumanism, as I understand it, is an ideology that seeks to liberate us from one another and from our mutual dependence by eliminating dependence altogether, by eliminating humanity.
Well, good afternoon. Thank you, Carter, for your speech. I'm very grateful to hear you today. Okay, I begin again. Okay, sorry. Thank you, Sr. Mark Carter. I am very grateful to hear you today. I have two questions. The first one points to humanism as a ground of public ethics, and the one points out to the critical note you made on transhumanism. I'd like to ask you if you think that another kind of humanism based on a positive vulnerability, a vulnerability as openness, as connection, as interdependence, could be a good ground for public ethics. And the second one is that you said that it is true that transhumanism seeks to overcome the finitude of the human through technology. But I'd like to ask you if it is possible to to embrace human finitude and at the same time to overpass the limits of the human, as perhaps the cultural posthumanism does. I'm thinking on Donna Haraway, but also other authors like Judith Butler and others. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those questions. I think it's obvious, and if, to the extent that I understood the premises of your question, I would say, and I hope this is responsive, that I think it's difficult, and one challenge is to not valorize human finitude and natural limits in a way that prevents us from seeking collectively and together to address them through conventional medicine, biotechnology, and therapies. It is the puzzle for bioethicists and folks who see the world the way I do, is to figure out a way to embrace therapy while rejecting the concept of enhancement, which of course transhumanism is all about enhancement. It's about enhancement that is driven by the desires of the individual. There are no limits to the forms of enhancement that might be pursued. And of course, the only way to define therapy and enhancement, or to distinguish between therapy and enhancement, and therapy is not alien to or hostile to anything I've said here today. Of course, I embrace the concept of using technology, biotechnology, and biomedicine to alleviate human suffering, to heal the sick and the injured, and to enhance the flourishing of individuals and our shared lives together. But the key question, and this is I think the major point of departure, transhumanists and individuals like myself who take a different view, is in order to define the difference between therapy and enhancement, is you have to define the concept of health itself. And my own view is that if you abandon the possibility of objective definition of health, namely something like the normal range of species-specific functioning, as Leon Cass and others have defined it, if you abandon the possibility of an objective standard for health, then we all become transhumanists, because we all become those who are committed to a subjective standard of health, which is merely defined by my will and my desire. And that ultimately means the annihilation of the practice of medicine itself, because medicine is an art, is organized around and professes a set of objective goods, the good of ministering to human health and to alleviate human suffering. But if human health is simply defined by the subjective desires of the individual, then there are no animating goods to orient the art of medicine, and it seeks to become an art and then devolves into a mere technical skill set that is applied for consumers according to their own wishes. And doctors won't be allowed to and won't be permitted. It won't even be intelligible for doctors to ask the question of whether or not their art dictates that a particular intervention is beneficial to the flourishing of the patient as they understand it, because there is no objective standard and it devolves into subjectivity. And that to me seems a very insecure footing onto ground law, policy, or even the practice of medicine, which is why I think transhumanism ultimately collapses on itself. It doesn't merely transform and arguably annihilate humanity, but it actually makes the practice of medicine as we've understood it for millennia impossible.
So, Carter, thank you so much. I'm not sure if we have time for one more question.
Sure, yeah, I have plenty of time.
This is fun.
I'm free to answer as much as you'd like.
I'm just looking at our tech guys, but they seem to give the go-ahead. So, please, final question.
Okay, great.
Okay, thanks a lot, Javier. Just a short remark, Professor. My comment is more on the grounds of bioethics more than transhumanism. I would like to know what can we learn here in Europe, where we are in a sort of wave of autonomy as the principal value, from the American society, in which there is more an idea in the public space, pro-family and pro-life. Because, for example, here in Spain, we have now a new law of euthanasia that gives primary importance to the autonomy of the person, the autodetermination of the person, and we also have a law on abortion, free abortion, that gives the women all the free choice about this. So I would like to know what sort of arguments could we have from the American society that I think that has more a clear idea on these things. Thanks a lot.
Thank you for the question. I worry that America has exported to Europe our individualism and has led to the embrace of autonomy in the ways that you described. And we need to recover what you all originally embraced, namely the concept of the common good and the notion of human dignity, which is a more European concept than an American concept. We are all about freedom and autonomy in the United States, but fortunately for us, we have a very robust community of persons, both religious and secular, who understand that the world is a lot more complicated than that, and that autonomy, while of course real and important, is only a very small part of the human story. The human story is a story of interconnectedness, and the human story is a story of reciprocal indebtedness. Mother Teresa said that if we don't have peace in the world, it's because we've forgotten that we belong to one another. And I think that the more we explain how we belong to one another and how, for example, in the context of abortion, the lens of autonomy describes the human conflict of abortion in such a foreign way. It describes the mother and the child as atomized individual strangers who are locked in conflict over scarce human resources, namely the body of the mother herself. And anyone who has ever loved anyone who's been pregnant or has been pregnant or has been around the miracle of pregnancy and birth understands that this is not an actual fair or human way to describe the context of human pregnancy. And to say, and what we have to recover, those of us who care about the unborn child, and of course their mother, we have to reframe the question as a tragic conflict involving a mother and her baby. And when we understand that there's a tragedy or a conflict involving a mother and her baby, we don't respond by trying to assign the rights to the conflicting parties and have them fight it out in an adversarial conflict. Instead, when decent people hear that a mother and baby are in distress, we drop what we're doing and we run to their aid. And that's the solution we have as pro-lifers. We have to say, we love the mother, we love the baby, we understand their interconnectedness, we understand that they both are in distress, they both require our need and our love and support. And I believe that politically, that kind of radical love and radical hospitality will be transformative and soften the hearts of those who are so passionately committed to abortion and euthanasia.
Okay.
You have a question?
Yes, thank you. I'm Father Michael Baggett. I work in Rome. I'm from the United States, so thank you very much for your presentation. I also really appreciated your latest book. I just finished a doctoral study on transhumanism, which takes a Thomistic perspective. It tries to put the natural, moral law, virtue ethics tradition in dialogue with the Oxford transhumanists like Bostrom and Savulescu, who maybe wouldn't call himself a transhumanist, but at least gives the kind of philosophical foundations for many other transhumanists. But at one point in my study, I look at how this notion of the division between the supposedly true inner self and this outward body, this kind of separable body, seems to underlie a lot of enhancement questions. I, of course, draw on Charles Taylor, then also Carl Elliott was helpful in that regard. So I appreciated your work on expressive individualism and these underlying anthropology questions that seem to really unite a lot of the bioethical issues. So I was wondering if you see this kind of continuity at work. I think that a lot of transhumanists are quite clear about adopting a radical notion of self-creation and self-determination. And we sort of have, it seems, the tools in their mind to accomplish what many other schools of thought, older schools of thought, wanted, but didn't have the technology to do. So I was wondering if you saw that connection, and then also one day I'd love to visit you in Notre Dame and share my research and talk about these themes in greater depth.
Well, thank you for that very thoughtful comment. I would love to have you come visit us at Notre Dame. Please, my center, the De Nicola Center for Ethics and Culture, would love to host you and to share your work and help support your work. I completely agree with everything that you've said. I believe that transhumanism does, in fact, it's radically dualistic in the way that you described, by separating the mind and the body. The mind is you, and the inside is you, and everything else is not you, but rather tools to be used to harness the desires of the self. I'm skeptical about their technological claims about that downloading our consciousness to some kind of hard drive or whatever. I'm sure I'm oversimplifying, obviously, what their claims are. But it seems to me, I would hope, the transhumanists are still, this may sound funny, they're still human beings, and I hope it's true that they have people in their lives that they love and care for who are not capable of flourishing in the purely cognitive framework that they espouse. What do you make of people who are disabled? What do you make of people who are radically dependent on medical technologies, who are not able to impose their will and rational mastery through cognition? I hope that would give them pause to think about the possible cruelty of a world in which those individuals are left behind or cast aside, whereas the masters of the universe, who can use this technology and wield this technology to become godlike, flourish and rise. I think the key is to call people back to remember their own vulnerability and to remember the vulnerability of those whom they love and who would not be counted among the elite in this vision of the world as technologically enhanced.
Well, thank you so much, Carter. Now we are running out of time, but I really want to thank you for the efforts. We are delighted we could have you at the end. And I have to tell you, we are really, really looking forward to develop this conversation and see how far it takes us by working among both institutions. We are very much hopeful that we will be able to have you here as soon as possible, and likewise that we will be able to be there very soon again. Thank you so much, and let's be in touch.
Thank you so much.
Porque verdaderamente lo que buscábamos en esta mesa y lo que vamos a tratar de hacer con el turno de preguntas es crear una cierta relación.
And now we're going to try and create a kind of connection between the three presentations. The first one by Dr. Enrique Gomez Aguilera on the development of a series of industries that are becoming more and more capable of enhancing human beings, and there's the question of whether that could result in the construction of human beings from an ideological point of view, removing a series of limitations which until recently could only be overcome by science fiction literature. And this would have led us to the presentation by Dr. Sneed, who would consider that how legal frameworks depend on the dominating anthropological conception of society. And this is what he wrote in his last book on the legal system in the US. And then we would go on to the political, economic, and business consequences that may result from certain dominating ideologies. And Professor Cortina was making a political or legal reflection. That is what we wanted to have in this session, and I'm sure that there will be questions from the audience. So I would like to invite those of you on the floor and those of you online to ask your questions for the two speakers, so that between us we can, get a clearer picture on the subject. I don't know whether there's any questions in the audience. Yes. Yes, now we can hear you. Right. So that anthropological question that Javier was mentioning, we have a couple of questions specifically. One of them says whether it could be said that transhumanistic ideology breaks away from the human purpose with respect to beatitude as an ultimate goal of human beings. And then I can ask the second question, or I can ask both questions together. Yeah, I think you should ask both questions together. Well, the second question is also related with the anthropological aspect. The question is, so your presentations raise a very important question in the opinion of some of the participants, which is, what defines man so that man can be conceived as a man? What is the philosophical and material nature that defines man? And what should science and the law, what role should science and the law play in this context?
Thank you very much. In the setting of this round table, as we have it now without Carter's participation, what we can do is the following. The response obviously is addressed to Carter. What we could try to do, if you agree, if the two professors agree, is try to start from those questions in order to bring them to the field of their own lectures, starting maybe by Albert, due to the legal implications and in the political and democratic order. I think that you have referred to this issue, and maybe we can from there on develop a response that will not be comprehensive, but that can bring us to an environment where we can move more easily. Yes. Yes, I think that along what you said, having as a subject the person, it's quite clear that after the concept of the person, there is an anthropological vision, and of natural law even, from our point of view. humanistic and Christian. So with everything that has been explained during these sessions, in which simply what we want to have is an anthropology or a philosophical movement, ideological movement that tries to have a superation of the person, going beyond. I don't know what this means in the traditional legal ordinance. We come from Roman law and a whole tradition that we, the jurists, are very conservative, and we don't anticipate, as do the scientists or even the philosophers, with these questions and these anticipation about what could be the consequences of specific actions. The jurists come always behind. When somebody is formulating, if somebody formulates that anthropological vision that the transhumanism wants, I don't think they will do that, because Professor Postigo stated that very clearly. It's like a collection of ideas, but there is no anthropological basis with solid pillars, as those that have been at the basis of our legal ordinance, our concept of person in the realm of law and fundamental rights. So the response is difficult, in my opinion, to understand how they, beyond the law of the desire, I want to put an implant on me, to have an antenna, to have more skills and capacities. And I want the law to recognize that. There is no alternative anthropological reflection that affects, from my point of view, the current legal ordinance. The legal concept of a person is dissolved, but there is no alternative from my point of view. Maybe, in order to write down what Professor Albert says, maybe anecdotal, I think that relevant to look at, for instance, some decisions of the Supreme Court in the rulings of the Supreme Court in the States and the Court of Justice in Europe on this essential point with respect to the anthropology that exists in both legal systems. Of course, here, the legal Court of Justice in the European Union has the capacity of having a direct influence on the generation of law and implementation of law in all member states. So somehow, without entering any legal issues, if it's a Supreme Court in the European institution. And there is a very recent ruling of this Court of Justice. I choose between several. The court from 5th of June 2018, where the Court of Law had to decide, or Court of Justice, the concept of a partner that has an influence on all the member states. The Court of Justice says that the concept of partner is neutral from the point of view of gender and can include the partner of the same sex of the citizen of the union that it's all about. Although this is brings a course of a sentence or a ruling of jurisprudence in the United States, where in a very famous and important manner in the issue Plum versus Casey from 1999, they state in the Tribunal Court that in the heart of the freedom of the person is the right to define the concept of existence, the significance of the universe. And that anthropological conception what it gives is liberty to the reconfiguration of the whole legal system with respect to a perception individualistic of the human being. One can reconfigure the more fundamental rights, the first generation of rights that Professor Albert said, from the point of view of freedom of each person, separated from all tradition and separated from the community. We can consider it as a basis on which we can build an ideological development that probably is as scientific, but nevertheless can generate a specific impact on the legal systems and the laws, and thus in the obligation derived from them. This is only just an idea, because Professor Carter Sneed will develop it with much more detail in his lecture, but probably he would have referred to this, because in his own book, What It Means to Be Human, he refers to those two ideas. Elena. Well, as Director of the Congress, I would like to apologize for this technical problem that we will hope to solve in the future. The key of Volta was the concept of human nature and its dissolution, as Albert Cortina has pointed out. In the transhumanism, it's thought as a fact. The non-reference to the concept of person or understanding the person, for instance, as the transfer of synaptic content to the cloud, as Anders Sandberg said in a post-humanistic version. It's clearly to remove what is the fundamental basis of our law and political construction. So with respect to this, and I asked a question to the whole panel, Professor Gomez Aguilera has said that yesterday, we mentioned that during lunch, all this is very regulated. We haven't to worry about what are the limits that biotechnology, that biomedical engineering, what the limits it has. The problem is this is changing. If there is no concept of human being, a concept of person, of personal identity, we are going to be giving rights to us and 100, 200 further on. It can be changing in the future and can implant what I will and do what myself. And this is the dissolution of our society. This afternoon we will talk about sexuality, family, etc. All this is going to affect all the social orders. So the question is, what can we do from a different perspective to the transhumanistic one in order to somehow put a brake to this type of policies that could go towards a dissolution of the person, of the law as we understand it, and a radical transformation of the society? Well, it's a quite complex question. Well, biomedical engineering, medical technologies industry as such, the one that is also interesting most, moves by the Hippocratic code. Any technology tries to, in fact, improve as much as possible and not damage. And this is very important. So that's why I say that it's a regulated market, and it's associated to the fact that practically maybe the same thing happens in biotechnology and other areas. That's why we have the biosecurity commissions. When this is taken from the point of view of the market that we understand, I don't know those. I don't want to see those dangers, because I can't make a development if I want to use cerebral magnetic simulation or with implanted electrodes. This has to be done for a specific goal. I will not be able to do that if they haven't been other pharmacological mediums or any other therapy that have not been efficient. That's where they appear. When we take out of context the use of this technology, well, then the difficulties start. The technologies are also protected. In fact, the problem that happened with COVID and the use of technologies linked to the ventilators is because they were registered and they couldn't. Some companies said the solution we need to specifically, because it was specifically to have the use of a technology that was unable to be produced. But one knew how to do it. Many people knew that they have the capacity of reproducing those ventilators, but it was patented and registered. They had to open that technology, and some did that. Some companies did that, others didn't, and it could be done. But this is how it is now. If we take out of context all this, there will be many technologies that we will not be able to easily reproduce. It's the software world. I share the ill-called artificial intelligence. We are unable to analyze the data in such a way that of professional management, because every medical device has algorithms and procedures that we call intelligent, is the badly used word. So there will be things that will be very much protected. This will not be easy. There is a market behind. They are not going to let that technology, and some others not. The biohacking is there. The technology has a more economic cost. It can really be done in a clear manner. And my concern, I repeat, are the other companies that you are mentioning, all the other corporations that have the capacity, because they do invest very much. They have capacity of innovation and technology capacity that reproduces this technology. And let's not talk about the Chinese world that has been specialized in that. Many of the technologies, and more so in the world of medical technology, come from Asia. If at that point in time this can be reproduced in the hardware world, that is the most complex one we can do. In the software is easier. Many of these procedures can't be easily protected. The other threat comes from the world of the wearables, that technology that is not created for a goal of health, the fitness and well-being. The great companies that did their bracelets, medical technology, have failed or have stopped because they consider that they can't use this type of device for a medical goal, for a health goal. So when we make the projects of research, we have to manage others that have another goal, but they do that under other conditions. Everything that you do, they have to leave the data, and we are sending information that we don't know how it is being used, and that is the truth. We don't know how it is being used. Well, I do see that threat in the case of the large corporations and companies that are technologies of information. In fact, yes, they are all behind that. I don't know how those codes, regulatory, ethical, legal codes can be carried out. Maybe they all have overcome that. I don't know up to what extent can we control. As far as I know, that we all who are sitting here, we have already mentioned that. They all know we are here. Our mobiles allow to have that information. I don't have an easy answer. Elena, I'm going to try to talk from two different perspectives, respond somewhat to your question. We are in an exploratory field. I've said that from the very beginning of my intervention. When I've been saying that the neoliberalism has realized that law of the individual desire, this extreme individualism, subject to emotions, is dissolving the societies and the governance, and is coming closer to a neo-communitarism or from the technologies on. For the time being, we don't understand that, but we just have to see the health measures that somehow were for the common good of public health, how they have been an instrument for these global organizations, have been respected for the common good in this case very rapidly. So they are realizing that, well, it's more of the same. We can't have more of the same. The legal ordinance will come closer to this idea of losing the person, the individuality of the person, its rights that until now we've had, and of the previous generations as well. I don't know what will happen with the fifth one, but with the corporation state that we've told about, we are becoming more similar to China. Is that the big question? What concept of person does the legal system that is developing this in China, what are they going to propose to us from Asia with respect to dignity, freedom, etc.? We have seen that it's a totalitarian state. We can't expect too much with respect to the dissolution of the person. But with respect to the legal ordinance, and here, Javier, I don't know if you agree, we have a legal system that is very rigid, and it's a topic. It's always behind the social and economic events, and it's far behind the scientific progresses that you have mentioned. And here we have important scientists that can confirm that. Nor ethics reaches on time as a self-regulation of the researcher and the scientist. This gives rise to a problem when the legislators take so long for them to reach a consensus in the parliament or wherever they have approved a law on whatever of the matters that we are talking about. The scientific advance is far ahead from them. Professor Federico Montalvo, president, mentioned something that is very British, Anglo-Saxon. We are going towards a law that is not so rigid with stiff laws, that we want to be long-lasting. We're going towards a legal system of general principles much wider. We don't have mentality to do that yet. I don't know, Javier, how you see that. The interpretation will be from the judges, supported by the bioethical committees. The great protagonist that Montalvo proposed for the future of how to regulate the case by case, because it's going to be impossible to have a general regulation on all the scientific advances of any of the matters that we have dealt with in this Congress. Will be some large principles. We will agree, I hope, on them. We will agree upon them. And then case by case, the judges will apply, or the bioethical committees in the hospitals, and we will go towards a somewhat more Anglo-Saxon system. I don't know if you see it, Javier, like I do. If you see this evolution where transhumanism, not so much as a conception of change of the human condition, but rather as acceleration of all the progress, we are going to, and that the ethics will come when it comes. It was quite clear that they were not too much concerned about it, and in law we will do the things case by case, solving the problems when they arise. American mentality. When the problem arises, let's try to solve it, and no big legal, no philosophical constructions. Well, as you are asking me directly, I would like to point out, hint at a response, but to discuss during break, lunch, or the coffee break afterwards. We are close to 11:30, and we want to respect the times. Albert, I think that these thoughts that you mentioned, and we can see that by several authors in the negative, or at least dangerous sense, that is the activism, I think he said. I have just indicated two rulings important that the legal activism. How can one redefine basic concepts that underlie legal systems with centuries of tradition that are unknown by great majority of the population, that gives a legitimacy to those judges? We have an issue on legitimacy that the courts have in order to be able to pronounce on issues that are enormously important for the future of the society. Where is the legitimacy? Of course, they have it in our liberal traditions of the separation of powers, in a setting where the judges start, as Montesquieu said, pronounce the words of law but generate law. And we have to wonder, what are the ideologies of the judges? What is the configuration of the judges? What are the rules that determine how these sentences or rulings are made? What's the level of democratic quality of those courts? And it's a problematic in constitutional law to establish what is the balance between the powers at each point in time. But I don't think that solution at least has some advantages in the Anglo-Saxon world, in the corporate law as well. But in the fundamental rights law, there are other issues that are posed. And I leave it there because it's just 11:34 and we are going to finish. Thank you very much for your attention.